Picture an ordinary apartment in Kharkiv before sunrise. The room is still dark. A phone lights up on a table. Then another. A message appears. 3 words. It has started. Outside, the sky flashes. Inside, a child is still asleep. For 1 second, history is not a textbook. It is a decision. Wake the child? Call your parents? Run to the hallway? Pack documents? Wait? Across Ukraine, millions of people were pulled into the same question. Is it happening? The answer arrived in the sky. Missiles, aircraft, columns of armor. Russian forces crossed into Ukraine from Russia, from occupied Crimea, and from Belarus. For people far away, the question was simple. Why? Why would Russia launch the largest war in Europe in generations? Why would Ukraine fight a much larger neighbor instead of making a fast deal? And why does every serious answer start dragging us backward? Back to 2014, then to 2008, then to 1994, then to 1991, then to the Soviet famine, then to empires, then to the Cossacks, then all the way back to medieval Kyiv. That is the first clue, but it is also where bad explanations begin. One person says, it was NATO. Another says, it was ancient history. Another says, it was one corrupt election. Another says, it was one leader's obsession. Each answer touches something real. None of them is enough. This first episode is about why those older stories mattered. Not because they made Ukraine Russia's property. Because Russia's leadership later reached for them to make invasion sound like reunion. So if this starts to feel like a history lesson, hold on to one thread. Which old stories later became political ammunition? By the end of this 3-part story, the answer will have 4 layers: security, empire, identity, sovereignty. NATO belongs in the story, but it is not the whole story. The full-scale invasion began on February 24, 2022, but the argument underneath it was older. It was an argument about land, memory, language, fear, and one dangerous question. Does Ukraine get to decide its own future? Or does Russia get a veto because of geography, history, and power? Before we rewind the map, there is one rule. History explains this war. History does not justify conquest. That matters because Russia's leadership often tells a historical story that sounds like this. Ukraine and Russia share deep roots. Therefore, Ukraine is not fully separate. Therefore, Ukraine's choices are not fully its own. The first sentence contains truth. The second and third are the dangerous leap. And be precise about the wording. Russia's leadership, the Russian state, the Kremlin. Those are not the same as every Russian person. They are not the same as every Russian speaker. That precision matters because this war has already turned identity into a weapon too many times. Shared history can be real. Shared history can shape language, religion, family, memory, and identity. But shared history is not ownership. 2 people can come from the same family and still live separate lives. 2 countries can share ancestors and still have different futures. That is the key that unlocks the older story. Start in Kyiv. Long before Moscow was the center of a powerful state, Kyiv was one of the most important cities in the medieval world of Eastern Europe. The polity historians call Kyivan Rus connected rivers, trade routes, princes, churches, towns, and peoples across a huge region. It was not modern Ukraine. It was not modern Russia. It was not modern Belarus. Those countries did not exist yet in the way we mean them now. But Kyivan Rus became part of the origin story for all 3. That is why it is powerful, and why it is easy to misuse. If you are building a Russian imperial story, medieval Kyiv can be presented as the beginning of one Russian civilization. If you are building a Ukrainian national story, medieval Kyiv can be presented as proof that Ukraine's history did not begin as a province of Moscow. Both stories reach for the same past, but they use it differently. One says, "We have ancient links, so we belong together under Moscow's power." The other says, "We have ancient roots, so we are not an artificial invention." The fight is not over who is allowed to remember Kyiv. The fight is over who gets to weaponize Kyiv. Medieval Kyiv is not firing missiles in 2022. But the story told about medieval Kyiv helps explain why Russia's leadership could describe domination as reunion. The person in that Kharkiv apartment did not wake up thinking about Kyivan Rus. But the story someone told about Kyivan Rus helped shape the missiles above the city. After Kyivan Rus fragmented and the Mongol invasions reshaped the region, the lands of today's Ukraine did not follow one simple road. Ukraine's history is not a straight line from medieval Kyiv to modern Kyiv. It is a crossroads. Parts of Ukrainian lands were connected to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Parts were tied to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Parts later fell under the Russian Empire. Western regions were shaped by the Habsburg monarchy. The Black Sea steppe saw Tatars, Ottomans, Cossacks, imperial expansion, trade, raids, migration, and settlement. Do not memorize the list. Remember the pattern. In the West, different empires shaped religion, language, law, and schooling. In the East and South, Russian imperial expansion reshaped power, land, and identity. In the steppe, borders could feel less like walls and more like moving weather. This is how Ukraine became both deeply connected to Russia and deeply separate from it. This is why the old map matters. Russia's leadership did not only fear what Ukraine might do, it questioned what Ukraine was. That is why Ukraine can look confusing from the outside. Languages overlap. Church traditions overlap. Families overlap. Cities changed names, rulers, and borders. But confusion from the outside is not emptiness. The land was not waiting for one empire to give it meaning. People lived there, farmed there, traded there, prayed there, rebelled there, built towns there, changed loyalties there. And over time, a Ukrainian cultural and political identity kept resurfacing in different forms. One of those forms was the Cossack world. The Cossacks were not a modern nation-state. They were not a clean democratic myth. They were frontier warriors, communities, leaders, alliances, and conflicts in a violent borderland. But Ukrainian memory often treats the Cossack hetmanate as a symbol of self-rule, a symbol of armed autonomy, a symbol that people on this land were not only subjects of someone else's empire. In the 1600s, Cossack politics became tied to Moscow through agreements that are still argued over today. Russia's historical story often turns that moment into permanent reunion. Ukrainian memory often sees it more as an alliance that Moscow later used to absorb autonomy. Again, the same event becomes two different maps. For empire, proof of unity. For Ukraine, a warning about promises made by a stronger neighbor. That warning will return in Part 2, when Ukraine gives up the nuclear weapons on its territory in exchange for security assurances. The older pattern is already visible. A smaller political community makes an arrangement with a stronger neighbor. Then the argument becomes what the promise really meant. As the Russian Empire expanded, more Ukrainian lands came under imperial rule. The empire needed Ukraine for grain, soldiers, geography, and access to the Black Sea. It also needed a story. In that story, Ukrainians could be treated as a branch of a larger Russian people, not as a separate political nation. Language and culture became political. Ukrainian writing, schooling, publishing, and public identity were encouraged in some places and restricted in others. In Western Ukrainian lands under Habsburg rule, Ukrainian identity developed under different conditions than it did in the Russian Empire. So when modern nationalism grew in the 19th century, Ukraine did not grow from one center only. Kyiv mattered, Kharkiv mattered, Lviv mattered, villages mattered, churches mattered, poets mattered. Imperial police mattered too, because suppression can teach people that their identity is powerful enough to be feared. This matters in 2022 because Russia's leadership did not only say Ukraine was dangerous, it often suggested Ukraine was not fully separate. This is not ancient trivia. It is the historical language later used to make invasion sound like reunion. That is an older imperial habit. Seeing Ukraine as a region, a borderland, a younger brother, a mistake of history, a place whose separate identity is tolerable as folklore, but dangerous as statehood. This is the reason Part 1 exists. Russia did not invent its claim over Ukraine in 2022. It reached for older stories, medieval origins, imperial habits, Soviet memory, language, World War II. The question is not whether those memories are real. Many are. The question is whether memory can cancel sovereignty. Then the 20th century made the story faster and darker. World War I broke empires apart. The Russian Empire collapsed. For a brief period, Ukrainians tried to build independent statehood in the chaos. There were rival governments, wars, foreign armies, Bolsheviks, nationalists, peasants, cities, and shifting borders. The dream of independence appeared. Then it was crushed. Most of Ukraine became Soviet Ukraine inside the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not simply the Russian Empire with a red flag. It created Ukrainian Soviet institutions. It recognized a Ukrainian Soviet Republic. In the 1920s, it even promoted some Ukrainian language and culture under early Soviet nationality policies. But then came Stalin, forced collectivization, political terror, mass arrests, purges, and the famine of 1932 and 1933, known in Ukraine as the Holodomor. Millions died. Food was taken. Villages were trapped. The countryside broke. Scholars debate classification, intent, and policy. But the mass death is not small. The forced grain seizures are not small. The restrictions on movement are not small. The trauma in Ukrainian memory is not small. For many Ukrainians, the Holodomor is evidence of what can happen when a state treats Ukrainian society as a problem to be controlled. It made power from the Soviet center in Moscow feel existential. And now the thread returns to 2022 again. When Ukrainians hear that their country must be corrected, protected, or absorbed by a larger power, many do not hear an abstract security argument. They hear echoes of a century in which control from the center could mean hunger, prison, silence, or deportation. Then came World War II. Ukraine became one of the bloodiest lands on earth. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Ukrainian cities and villages were occupied. Jewish communities were murdered in the Holocaust. Millions of Ukrainians fought in the Red Army. Some Ukrainian nationalists fought both Soviets and Nazis at different moments. Some collaborated with Nazi Germany. Some civilians simply tried to survive. This history refuses to become a slogan. That is why Russia's later claim of denazification is so loaded. For many Russians, World War II is sacred national memory. Sacrifice, survival, victory over Nazism. Calling an enemy Nazi places a war inside Russia's most powerful moral myth. And because Ukraine's World War II history includes both massive anti-Nazi sacrifice and controversial nationalist movements, propaganda can cherry-pick one part and pretend it explains the whole country. That does not make the claim true. Ukraine's past contains ugly chapters. So does Russia's. So does Europe's. But a difficult past does not give a neighboring state the right to invade. After World War II, Soviet Ukraine was rebuilt, industrialized, urbanized, and integrated deeply into the Soviet system. Millions moved. Russian became especially powerful in cities, industry, the military, and Soviet public life. Ukrainian remained central in many families, villages, regions, books, songs, and private worlds. Many people lived bilingually. A simple outside mistake is to hear Russian language and assume Russian loyalty. That is wrong. A person can speak Russian and still be Ukrainian. A city can have Soviet monuments and still reject Russian occupation. A family can have relatives on both sides of a border and still believe that the border matters. This is why language cannot be used as a shortcut. Russian speech did not automatically mean Russian loyalty in 2022. That mistake would matter enormously. Because any invasion plan that expected Russian-speaking cities to welcome Russian control was already misunderstanding Ukraine before the first column crossed the border. In the next part, that border becomes the center of the story. Because one vote in 1991 would later destroy the claim that Ukraine was invented by the West. If you remember only one date before 2022, remember this one. December 1st, 1991. Because if Ukraine voted for independence, not just in Kyiv, but across the country, then the next question becomes harder. Why did Moscow still act as if Ukraine's future needed Russian permission?